This video is brought to you by Private Internet Access. In 1976, Hector Hermann Oesterheld was on the run, in hiding, in fear for his life. He only went outside in disguise, wearing a fake beard, dark sunglasses, and a fedora pulled low over his face. So where was he going on those dangerous excursions? To his publisher's office to drop off the script for the next issue of his comic series. That's right, despite the threat of death, Oesterheld was still writing comics. He was writing The Eternaut Part 2, a sequel to his groundbreaking work from 19 years earlier. The original Eternaut is one of the greatest works in the history of comics, and upon its publication in 1957, quickly became one of the most popular Argentine comics ever. Ironically, The Eternaut is about an unseen invader who attacks Buenos Aires and the everyday people who band together to rise up against them. Now, in his real life, Oesterheld had spent the past few years on the run from the AAA, a death squad under the secret control of an occultist known as the Warlock, who had been conducting the extrajudicial killings of hundreds of people they considered a threat to the Argentine government. People like Oesterheld. And on the evening of March 24th, he would have watched as all the TV stations were cut off and replaced by a military march, repeating the alert that, as of today, the country is under the operational control of the General Commander's Junta of the Armed Forces. The military had finally overthrown what remained of Argentina's democracy. The AAA's killings would soon be dwarfed by the campaign of kidnapping, torture, and murder the military junta would conduct. The very day they took power, hundreds of people opposed to their rule disappeared off the streets of Buenos Aires. And whether he knew it or not, the military was closing in on Oesterheld too. They would raid his publisher's office, demanding his location. His publisher wouldn't give him up, but he did tell Oesterheld that it was probably time to get out of the country. But Oesterheld wouldn't run, wouldn't stop writing his comic. In these, his final months of freedom, did he ever stop to wonder, how did this happen? 25 years earlier, he had been a geologist living in a country with what seemed like a stable democracy, with a nice home in an upper-class neighborhood, a wife who was pregnant with their first child. He had never even read a comic book. How did everything change so quickly? Hector Hermann Oesterheld just wanted to be a writer. Professionally, he was a geologist, but this reserved, quiet scientist devoured literature. He knew writing was his real calling. In the late 1940s, he had gotten a part-time freelance job writing children's books, which at least gave him an outlet for his passion. But then, in 1951, his publisher had a question for him. They wanted to know if he could write a comic book. You see, this publisher believed that comics had a future in Argentina and had convinced a group of incredibly gifted Italian artists to relocate to Argentina to help them revitalize their industry. But the Italians had only one writer in their group, and they needed more scripts, so the publisher turned to Oesterheld, one of their most talented writers of children's books, to see if he could contribute. His wife, Elsa, was against it. She knew that her husband was an intellectual, a lover of great literature, a man who read everything from Borges to Verne, Melville to Chandler. Why would he want to work in a low medium like comic books? But Oesterheld saw it as an opportunity. Something that informed his work on children's books, that would inform his life and his career, was his deep affinity and empathy for the young people of his country. He saw that so many kids in Argentina did not have access to books or television, but that comics could be Argentina's mass medium, could stimulate their imagination and teach them about history, science, and the human spirit. So Oesterheld took the job, and unlike so many people working in comics in any country in the 50s, he took it seriously. He wasn't satisfied to turn in scripts with simple, strong-jawed muscle men with paper-thin plots that were just an excuse for artists to draw big battles. He wanted to create comics that were meaningful, that were literate. His first major creation was Bull Rocket. A former Marine, Rocket would begin to establish Oesterheld's formula. He worked outside of the government, and he didn't work alone, but succeeded because he was part of a team with other regular people. This approach was crystallized in Oesterheld's second major creation. His publisher assigned him, along with the brilliant Italian artist Hugo Pratt, to create a Western, but I can't imagine Sergeant Kirk is what they had in mind. Kirk is a US Army soldier serving on the western frontier, but after participating in a massacre of American Indians, begins to have doubts about the righteousness of his cause. He soon deserts the army and ends up befriending a local tribe and having adventures throughout the West. And it's important to note that Oesterheld does all this without sacrificing the adventure qualities of his stories. While these comics are subversive, they aren't preachy or dull. They're as exciting, or maybe more exciting, than anything else from this era, precisely because there is so much humanity, so much emotional complexity underpinning every story. And in these heroes, I believe we get a glimpse of Oesterheld's own values. They're not lone men, but part of a group, of a society of people who work together to overcome their enemy. Their power comes not from a government authority, but from their own internal strength and their bond with an unlikely group of companions. The inherent distrust in government that Oesterheld's early work exhibits is not that surprising considering the time and place in which he grew up. He came of age in what was later called the infamous decade in Argentina. Now, summarizing decades of Argentine history is beyond the scope of this video, and so I'm just going to apologize in advance for how reductive this will be and try to be as apolitical as I possibly can, but please consider exploring the sources I've linked below if you want a more full picture. In 1930, Argentina would experience its first, but not its last, military coup. The following years were marked by a series of rigged elections, economic instability, and vast social upheaval. And in 1943, a second military coup and dictatorship. But in 1946, the people of Argentina came together to democratically elect Juan Perón to office. Perón is a difficult figure to talk about, with a long and complex legacy, but as a broad generalization, his election marked the start of a period of relative stability for Argentina, and it was during Perón's presidency that Oesterheld began his career as a comic writer, and his writing struck a nerve with the people of Argentina. The magazine that carried Bull Rocket and Sergeant Kirk grew and grew, selling 220,000 copies per week. Those sales would have made it a top comic in the United States, but this was in a country with a population a tenth the size. Just as he had foreseen, comics were becoming the mass medium of Argentina. Soon, the comics became so successful that he was able to quit his job and become a full-time writer. This was a period of great happiness for him, where he was able to devote himself to his two loves, his writing and his 4 daughters. But that time of stability for both Oesterheld and Argentina was about to come to an end. By 1955, after 9 years in power, Perón's popularity had begun to erode. On June 16th of that year, crowds gathered in the Plaza de Mayo to watch a celebratory Air Force demonstration. But that morning, a mutiny had begun at multiple Air Force schools, and shortly after midday, Air Force planes supposedly ready to participate in the homage began bombing the Plaza de Mayo, with a notable and wanton disregard for the lives of the people gathered in the plaza to watch the expected flyover. Their aim was above all to kill Perón, and they had few scruples about the method chosen. Estimates of the dead vary from 130 to over 500, and many of those were civilians. Perón survived the attack, and loyal army troops put down the coup, but the stability wouldn't last. Another coup attempt was made in September, and this time, to avoid violence, Perón stepped down and went into exile. The new dictatorship worked to erase every trace of Perón. Supporting him, even speaking his name, was made illegal, and all evidence of him was erased. It was in this vastly different political landscape that Oesterheld would begin the next phase of his career. In 1956, Oesterheld invited the artists he had been working with over to his home. He announced to them that he and his brother would be launching their own comic publishing company. He promised them creative freedom, profit sharing, and the ownership of their creations. Again, this is almost 30 years before those practices began being commonplace in American comics, but Oesterheld was living those values that he put on the pages of his comics. His belief in the power of the collective of ordinary people. This new publishing house was born with 2 main magazines, Frontera and Hora Cero. Oesterheld's house became the center of activity, with Oesterheld himself writing the majority of the scripts. But the quality of these comics is astounding. Oesterheld brought over Sergeant Kirk, but in just a few months, he and his artists would create a number of other iconic works. He and Alberto Breccia, who we'll talk more about later, created Sherlock Time. With Pratt, he launched Ernie Pike. In Pike, Oesterheld again subverts genre expectations. It's a war comic, but not really like any other war comic. Pike is a journalist, and Pratt based his appearance on Oesterheld. The stories don't focus on allies versus Axis, but on humanity versus the war itself. The German soldiers are portrayed as sympathetically as the allies. Their shared fate is that of men being used and manipulated by distant governments. It's pacifistic, maybe, but more than anything, it's humanist. Oesterheld displays a deep empathy for the soldiers and an ever-increasing disdain for government authority. But all of his humanist, his anti-government, his edge-of-your-seat storytelling skills would come together in his masterpiece, The Eternaut. In September of 1957, Oesterheld, along with the artist Francisco Solano Lopez, would begin serializing The Eternaut in Hora Cero Weekly in 3-page installments. It would capture the imagination of the Argentine public like nothing ever had before. The story opens with a time traveler, the Eternaut, arriving at Oesterheld's door to tell him of the future. Knowing Oesterheld's ultimate fate and how resonant this work is with his later life, sometimes it's easy to feel like it really was written by a time traveler. The Eternaut begins with a snowfall over Buenos Aires that kills everyone it touches. By sheer coincidence, a group of friends, ordinary people, are inside and spared by the disaster. They make homemade suits to protect themselves from the deadly snow and begin to venture out and discover the truth of their situation. Without spoiling too much here, I'll just say that it is the embodiment of all of Esterheld's beliefs. The power of the common man to band together against nameless, faceless evil. The uselessness and downright negligence of government bodies. The idea that everyone in the fight on both sides are victims of the unseen forces controlling them. And, above all else, the importance of family as the driving force. As in Osterheld's own life, his protagonist, Juan Salvo, is dedicated to his family, desperate to protect his wife and daughter and to create a safe world for them to live in. We see, almost immediately, what heroism looks like for Osterheld. As the heroes build their homemade suits, one of the group needs to test it and see if it will actually protect them from the snow. All of these men are terrified of death, but all of them want to be the first one to test it and spare their companions. They roll a dice to decide, each simultaneously hoping and not hoping it will be them. This is heroism for Osterheld. Not the man who runs into the fight without fear, but the man who is almost paralyzed by fear, by concern for his own family, but who has to balance those feelings with the need to serve and protect his fellow man. But here's the other thing about that sequence. Like the rest of the Eternaut, it's incredibly tense and incredibly well done. Even if you remove all the political elements, even if you separate it from Osterheld's own life, we would still be talking about the Eternaut as one of the greatest comics of all time. As a simple sci-fi adventure story, Robinson Crusoe in the city, it's brilliant. Every moment, from the roll of the dice to epic battles, is paced perfectly. The large cast of sharply drawn characters brings you into the action, which Solano Lopez renders like a gritty war comic, down to recreating actual locations around Buenos Aires. It feels like Osterheld and Solano Lopez envisioned what a $300 million blockbuster film would look like decades before Hollywood ever made one. I don't think there exists a comic from the 1950s that feels more contemporary and readable today. Nearly 40 years before Americans would be arguing about how comics need to grow up, Osterheld created a genuine literary classic in the comic medium. Had it gotten translated into English, I have no doubt that we'd be talking about Osterheld in the same breath as other literary comic writers like Alan Moore and Neil Gaiman. But sadly, it took until 2015 to be released here and has since gone out of print and become an expensive collector's item. I can only wonder at how different both American comics and Osterheld's own life would have been if he had found a publisher here, because despite his artistic triumph, his life was about to take a dramatic turn. As you guys probably know, I value my privacy. That's why I use today's sponsor, private internet access, every time I go online. In my opinion, if you're using the internet and you're not using a VPN, you're taking an unnecessary security risk. Whenever you go online, you are transmitting a huge amount of information which can be viewed by various different entities before reaching its intended destination. But a VPN is an app that hides your IP address and safeguards your internet connection through an encrypted tunnel. Additionally, many websites and streaming services block or restrict content depending on your location. But with PIA, you can change your IP address to one of 91 different countries and all 50 US states. So if, for instance, you're traveling and you want to watch a streaming show that's only available in your home country, it's easy to do so. And the reason I use private internet access over other VPNs is because they have a no-log policy, meaning that unlike some other VPNs, they never record or store their users' data, which has been proven in multiple real-world court cases. Finally, if you use my link at piavpn.com/mattwith4ts, right now you get 83% off and 4 months free. So it only works out to a few dollars per month to protect your privacy and your identity. They even offer a 30-day money-back guarantee, so there's really no risk to signing up today and checking it out. While Osterheld and his brother had managed to light the comics world on fire, their ability to run a business was not as strong. There are a combination of factors to that, but one of the greatest forces was that the artists felt that Osterheld was not paying them fairly as he had promised. They saw how popular their work was. They saw how many people were reading Frontera and Horacero, yet it wasn't reflected in what they were getting paid. And soon Fleetway and other publishers would lure away all of his top artists. It wouldn't be until years later that Osterheld learned that, in his naivete, he had left the printing plates for the comics at his printers. And after they finished the official run of his comics, they would run the press late into the night, printing thousands and thousands of copies that were sold, but that Osterheld was never paid for, and as a result, that he couldn't pay his artists for. But it was too late. As the 60s dawned, he could no longer pay his bills. He turned over the rights to his magazines to another publisher to cover his debts. He had turned comics into a mass cultural phenomenon, but at the end of the day, his artists were gone, and he was broke with a wife and 4 daughters who depended on him for support. His wife Elsa encouraged him to get a real job, to give up on comics, but writing was his love, and he didn't want to give up. He would do anything required of him to keep writing. He even kept working for the publisher that had seized his magazines, as well as writing for magazines that blatantly ripped off Horacero and others whose pages were filled with pirated copies of other works. But through it all, he would always try to do his best work. It was during this period, another period of political turmoil, in which the president, an ally of the exiled Perón, was deposed by the military, that Oesterheld would create his other most enduring masterpiece, Mort Cinder. Mort Cinder is easily one of the most surprising experiences I have ever had reading a comic book. Yet again, it feels like Oesterheld had a time machine, because it is truly hard to believe this comic was published in 1962. Let me put this in context for American comic readers. This came out before Avengers #1. Now that's no slight on Jack Kirby and the wonderful American comic art of the 60s, but Breccia is doing things in this comic that are on a completely different level. His wife was gravely ill at the time, and he was drawing like a madman to try and make money to cover her mounting medical debts. He drew Mort Cinder as she was slowly dying in the next room, and you can feel the overwhelming dread and sadness that spills from his pen onto every page. The story concerns an old antiquarian who befriends Mort Cinder, a man who dies and is reborn again and again. And here too, just read as a straight sci-fi, horror, history adventure, it works. I can't help but feel like this was an influence on everyone from Guillermo del Toro to Mike Mignola to Frank Miller. It's horror, but it's action-packed. It's somber, but it's still pulse-pounding. But the defining factor of Mort Cinder to me is how it makes us view our own history. As the antiquarian finds old objects, Mort is stirred by reminiscences of his past lives, always as a common man, a slave, a prisoner, a soldier, or a sailor. These are stories of the past, but they always connect to the present, often in quite tangible ways, reminding us that, as Oesterheld quotes, "Every day is the son of yesterday." And through it all is Oesterheld's humanism, his empathy for his fellow man that even extends to army deserters, tyrants, and murderous aliens. And thankfully this one is available in English, at least for now, in this beautiful edition from Fantagraphics, and I'll put a link to it in the description. Shortly after Mort Cinder's conclusion, Argentina held democratic elections, but yet another coup would eject the president just a few months later. This increasing political strife in his country was about to begin Oesterheld on a very different phase of his career. As his daughters grew older, the house that had once been filled with comic artists began to be filled with young people. The Argentinian youth, the kids who had only known an endless cycle of fraudulent elections, military coups, and economic uncertainty, had a radically different political viewpoint than the older generations. In many Argentinian households, this led to a strong generational clash. But Oesterheld was different. Just as he had with his children's books and his comics, he was interested and invested in the thoughts of the younger generation. He allowed his daughters and their friends to speak freely and was open to their ideas about how to build a better Argentine society. In the original Eternaut, the comic writer wonders if by publishing comics he could avert the disasters that the time traveler told him of. Now, inspired by this new line of thinking, Oesterheld himself would try to do just that. Just as he once saw comics as a way to educate a mass populace with little access to knowledge, he now saw comics as a means to introduce the mass populace to revolutionary ideas. There are conflicting reports of where the initial idea originated, but a publisher wanted to do a series of comic biographies of important Latin American historical figures to be written by Oesterheld and illustrated by Breccia. The first volume would be a biography of Che Guevara, who had died only a few years earlier, with art by Alberto Breccia and his son Enrique. While Oesterheld was apparently anti-communist, it was here in Che that he would begin asserting his politics more forcefully in his work, with dire consequences. Before we get into that though, we need to look at Che, because this is an absolutely wild book. The father-son Breccia team pushed the abstraction that began in Mort Cinder to new extremes. The central story is surprisingly straightforward. Oesterheld takes the military adventure format that he had mastered long ago and applies it to Che's guerrilla actions in Cuba and beyond. But his script extends outwards, mixing in Che's diary with his own thoughts, as the story veers between introspection and military action. The passages by the younger Breccia cover the final weeks of Che's life in an increasingly abstract fashion, as he passes from being a person to a martyr to a revolutionary symbol. This one is also available in English, so I'll link it down below as well. This was dangerous work to produce during a military regime. The publisher offered to allow Oesterheld to leave his name off of it, but Oesterheld refused. A story with a character like Che does not deserve to be made in secret. Not only do I want to sign it, but I want my name on the cover. Some would say that that was a fatal decision. Oesterheld's politics were beginning to put him at odds with his wife and many of his peers. I think this passage of Che perhaps gives us some insight into what he was feeling. Will they ever understand? A true revolutionary is guided by great feelings of love. Every day they have to fight so that this love of living humanity is transformed into concrete acts. Acts that serve as an example of movement. The revolutionary is consumed in this uninterrupted activity that has no end but death, unless the work is achieved on a global scale. Even before the book came out, it was criticized in one of Argentina's biggest newspapers as a dangerous work that would corrupt the youth. Despite that, or perhaps because of it, it was a sales success. So successful, in fact, that the military government seized all the printing plates and destroyed them before any more copies could be made. But Esterheld would not stop with his provocations. For his next work, he decided to write a remake of The Eternaut, reflecting the new state of the world in 1969. As Solano Lopez had at this time fled the country to avoid the increasingly repressive government atmosphere, the remake would be drawn by Breccia. In it, Breccia takes the artistic innovations that had started on Mort Cinder, had continued on Che, to new heights. The work is almost abstract, suggestive, and incredibly tactile. It's also absolutely gorgeous, but is not at all what mainstream readers were expecting and was criticized for being jarring and downright confusing. Due to its unpopularity, they would be forced to cut the story short, jamming what was a 300-page story into just over 50 pages. But by comparing it to the original, we can see the evolution of Esterheld's mindset. In this version, Juan Salvo, rather than being an everyman Robinson Crusoe, is more stridently militant. As Juan observes the other survivors, he thinks to himself, everyone trying to adjust to the new situation. Every man born anew. I, on the other hand, am almost happy. Action, at last, action. To fight against the invader, I discover that hate in action is atrociously joyful. Those weren't empty words for Osterheld. Action would become the defining force in the next chapter of his life. The political strife of the next few years would only increase. Again, I cannot possibly do justice to 50 years of Argentine history in a video about comic books, so please forgive me for summarizing down to the points that are most relevant to Osterheld's own story, and consider checking out the sources below. The same month that the Eternaut remake debuted, students and trade unions came together to protest against the military and security forces. The military sent troops in to stop the protest, and 14 people were killed. As a result, more and more groups opposed to the military sprang up. On the one-year anniversary of that event, one of those groups, Montoneros, made itself known by capturing and executing one of the military's generals. Esterheld and all 4 of his daughters would join Montoneros and work to support their cause of Catholic socialism and the return of Perón. Osterheld would join the press division, using his writing abilities to help further their cause. This was a dangerous decision. In retaliation for the assassination, the military began capturing and imprisoning supporters of Montoneros and other similar youth groups. When a group of these military prisoners escaped, they were not only recaptured, but lined up and shot dead. To quote Jill Hedges, any hope of national accord appeared further away than ever. But then, in 1973, after 17 years of exile, Perón was finally going to be allowed back into the country. He had been courting both sides of the political spectrum, and both the left and the right were eager for his return and saw it as a chance for their country to finally heal. But a bit of context here. During his exile, Perón's wife had grown close to the occult figure Jose Lopez Rega, who had become known as the Warlock. A mysterious far-right figure who had been part of Perón's police guard, he began having more and more influence over her, and by extension, Perón himself. The day Perón returned to Argentina should have been a celebration. Osterheld, along with his daughters, joined the crowd of 3 million people to welcome him back and witness his return, marching with signs of Montoneros' support for him. But before Perón even arrived, the shots began. Likely organized by the Warlock and his allies in the unions, military, and police, snipers on the platform began firing into the crowd, specifically targeting members of youth movements like Montoneros. The crowd fled in panic. Officially, 13 people were killed and 365 were injured, but some sources claim the real number is much higher. Back at the Osterheld home, Elsa waited nervously for her husband and daughters to return. One by one, they made it back. They were safe, but many others had been killed. The cycle of violence only escalated. Montoneros would increase the use of bombing and assassination in the name of resistance. And then, on July 1st, 1974, Perón died from a heart attack. His wife, who was also his vice president, would succeed him in office. This allowed the Warlock even greater freedom, and his death squad, the AAA, ramped up the killings of anyone they deemed subversive, which included members of Montoneros. The lives of the Osterhelds were gravely at risk. But instead of stopping his work, quitting Montoneros, in 1975, Hector Herman Osterheld walked out his front door to continue his resistance as a fugitive. He would never return. To quote The Eternaut, the book he had written 18 years earlier, "I knew we were defeated. I knew it was the end. I felt a kind of desperate rage. I wasn't Juan Salvo anymore, but a cornered beast, fighting for its life, ready to kill in order to keep its family alive for a few minutes longer." And now we've reached where we started this story, with Osterheld on the run and the military junta seizing power and escalating the use of kidnapping, torture, and killing of any opposition in what would later be known as the Dirty War. And, either because of Vida del Che or their involvement in Montoneros, the Osterhelds were on the military's list. On June 19th, 2 men grabbed Beatriz off the street, pinning her arm so she couldn't take a suicide pill. She was 19. Diana disappeared on August 7th. She was pregnant with her second son. A week later, her husband disappeared as well. She was 23. Marina was kidnapped on November 27th. She was 20 years old and also pregnant. All three were tortured and killed in captivity. The following year, when the men came for Estella, she would run and they would shoot her dead in the street. She was 25. As his daughters were kidnapped and killed one by one, Hector Osterheld was on the run, continuing his work for Montoneros and racing to finish The Eternaut Part 2. This, his final work, is our best and only insight into what he might have been thinking during this time. This is the story that he risked his life to deliver to his publisher. In The Eternaut Part 2, Juan Salvo, along with his wife, daughter, and Osterheld himself, are flung to the far future, to a world in which alien invaders have conquered the Earth. Their leader prepares to abandon the planet, and to fuel his rocket he needs to sacrifice hundreds of the Earth's youths. Juan Salvo, in this version, becomes nearly a superhero to stand up to him. Far from the empathetic man he once was, he now is willing to make any sacrifice necessary to defeat the enemies of humanity. As they overtake the alien fort, he says of their casualties, "But their sacrifice won't be in vain. What do a few lives matter?" It is both a reversal and an extension of the original Eternaut. The Juan Salvo of the original was driven by the need to save his family, but not anymore. This Juan Salvo fights not for his family, but for the whole of humanity. In the final chapters of the Eternaut Part 2, he even allows his wife and daughter to die so that he can defeat the aliens. But it works. By the end of the story, Juan Salvo and the fictional Osterheld have succeeded in creating a utopia. In the final pages, Osterheld wonders, "We are victorious, yes, but at what cost?" After mulling it over, he decides, "You made the right decision, Juan. It's only that it hurts so much." By the time those words were published, he was already dead. Osterheld was captured on April 27, 1977. After months of torture, he was most likely executed in February 1978 in a field outside Buenos Aires. His body has never been found. The story of the Osterheld family is tragic, but sadly, it is not unique. Democracy was restored to Argentina in 1983, but between 1974 and 1983, somewhere between 8,500 and 30,000 people disappeared. But Osterheld's story doesn't end with his death. In the years since its publication, the Eternaut has become a global, universal symbol of resistance. He is Juan Salvo, the common man in his homemade spacesuit, who belongs to no organization besides that of humanity, who stands in the face of overwhelming odds, not a man who's unafraid, but one who is brave enough to overcome his fear to fight for the things he believes in. Osterheld's works are enduring literary masterpieces of humanism, as relevant today or more so than ever before. In this way, to me, Osterheld most resembles another of his iconic creations, Mort Cinder, the man who cannot die, who comes back again and again to force us to confront our present actions in the context of our history, who rises from the grave once more to ask us, is the past as dead as we believe? Thank you guys so much for watching. Please like, subscribe, and comment down below to support this video. If you want to learn more about Osterheld's story and you speak Spanish, I strongly recommend Los Osterheld by Fernanda Nicolini and Alicia Beltrami. I really hope it gets published in English someday. There are also a number of wonderful Spanish language documentaries that I'll link below. Finally, a huge thank you to the team who helped me put this video together. The English sources available on Osterheld are thin and often inaccurate, and this video simply wouldn't exist without the Argentinian and Spanish-speaking comic lovers who came on board to help me out. My specific thanks go out to my research assistants and translators, Juan Augustin Mucci, Sofia Hernandez, and Marcos from the Ruined Maniac files, as well as all of you who emailed with me, spoke with me, and everybody who reached out and offered their support. As always, any mistakes, mispronunciations, and any political statements are entirely my own. Thanks so much, and I'll see you soon.